For the past year or so, Israel and the US, or at least their respective leaders, Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump, have been joined at the proverbial hip. The two have showered one another with public praise, and, as you might have noticed, launched a joint war against Iran that involved an unprecedented degree of cooperation between the American and Israeli militaries. However, Trump's push for a deal, before Israel has achieved any of its maximalist strategic objectives, has suddenly put the relationship in fresh jeopardy. So in this video, we're going to explain why Israel and the US are falling out over this latest deal, and why the relationship looks unlikely to recover anytime soon. Trump has launched so many military interventions that it's kind of hard to keep track. So in the latest issue of our magazine, Too Long, we go instance by instance to work out what Trump's been doing around the world, and if he's launching a holy war. That's just some of the 80 pages in the magazine, because there's more to Too Long than you'd expect. Purchase your copy by clicking the link in the description. So, we're going to split this video into two parts. First, we're going to explain why Israel and the US are headed for falling out in the short term. And second, we're going to explain why relations are unlikely to recover in the longer term. Let's start with the first bit, why the two countries are headed for a falling out. The short answer is, unsurprisingly, Iran. Originally, Iran looked like it might bring Israel and the US closer together, or at least the Netanyahu and Trump administrations. Both Netanyahu and Trump believe that Obama's original Iran deal, technically known as the JCPOA, wasn't good enough, and both were willing to use military force in pursuit of a better one. Not only that, the Trump administration was willing to cooperate with the Israeli military to an unprecedented degree. The US strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities during last year's 12-day war were the first time that the US military had directly intervened in an Israeli war in an offensive manner, and this year's war marked the first time that the two countries' air forces had mounted a joint campaign. Now, it's worth saying that the US and Israel never had identical strategic goals. Most obviously, Israel was always more comfortable than the US with the prospect of state collapse in Iran, which would essentially remove Israel's main geopolitical nemesis, but generate destabilizing consequences for America's Arab and European allies, which would probably leave the US primarily responsible for cleaning up any subsequent mess. Nonetheless, even if they weren't exactly on the same page, Trump and Netanyahu were at least united in their belief that military action would be able to force Iran to make further concessions. Most notably, Trump and Netanyahu consistently demanded that Iran totally give up its nuclear enrichment, rather than the 3.67% limit agreed in the JCPOA, and accept limits on its ballistic missile program and support for its proxy network, neither of which were covered by the JCPOA. As you probably already know, this isn't how things have panned out. Military action has failed to coax Iran into any huge concessions, or at least none big enough to satisfy Israel. Conversely, Iran has apparently been able to impose sufficient costs on the US, largely by disrupting the Strait of Hormuz and global energy markets, to get Trump to water down his demands. Much depends on what the final agreement ends up looking like, but all evidence available suggests that Trump is heading for a deal that looks very similar to Obama's, which both Trump and Netanyahu have spent most of their political careers decrying. For instance, in a call with the New York Times on Monday morning, Trump, who previously insisted on zero enrichment, admitted that Iran would be allowed to enrich uranium to non-military levels, which sounds pretty similar to the JCPOA. Furthermore, it looks like Trump has given up on trying to expand the scope of negotiations to include Iran's missile program and its proxy network. On the contrary, Trump is trying to force a ceasefire upon Israel in Lebanon, where the IDF is currently fighting a war against Hezbollah, Iran's main proxy. Unsurprisingly, Trump's attempts to extricate the US from its war in Iran have left Israel in a bit of a strategic lurch and done immense damage to Netanyahu's personal prospects. News of the deal has gone down terribly in Israel, and Netanyahu's odds of staying on as prime minister after the next election have now fallen to an all-time low, at least according to Polymarket. The deal will thus presumably put serious strain on the US-Israel relationship, which looks unlikely to be resolved by the upcoming Israeli election, given that all of Netanyahu's potential replacements are fervently opposed to the deal. Leaders of both the Together and Yashar parties, who are both polling at about 20%, just behind Netanyahu's Likud party, have come out to oppose the deal, with Together's co-leader Yair Lapid declaring that Netanyahu lost the war, and Yashar leader Gadi Eisenkot insisting that Israel must win. And this brings us nicely onto the second reason to think that the US-Israel divorce is inevitable. The next US president is unlikely to be anywhere near as pro-Israel as Trump is. This is essentially because American public opinion towards Israel has soured dramatically. According to Pew polling from earlier this year, for instance, just 37% of Americans have a favourable view of Israel, compared to 60% who have an unfavourable view. This is down from 45% in 2025 and 55%, an outright majority, as recently as 2022. There is a partisan split here, with Republicans generally expressing more favourable opinions of Israel than Democrats, but it's important not to overstate this. For starters, 41% of Republicans have an unfavourable opinion of Israel, which is a pretty sizable minority, and polling reliably finds that a large faction of Republicans basically just support whatever Trump does. So if Trump turns on Israel, even just a little bit, we should expect Republican sentiment to follow suit. Furthermore, there's a far more acute generational shift, with young people expressing significantly more negative opinions towards Israel than older generations. This is pretty terrible news for US-Israel relations going forward, given young people are entering the American electorate and old people are leaving it. American politicians are obviously aware of these polls, which is why even formerly pro-Israel ones have already started repositioning. Earlier this year, for instance, Gavin Newsom, formerly a staunch supporter of Israel and the current frontrunner for the Democratic nomination in 2028, told Pod Save America that the US ought to rethink its military support for Israel, and even described Israel under Netanyahu as an apartheid state. The point we're trying to make is that US-Israel relations aren't in a great place at the moment, and will probably get worse after the next election, in either country. This isn't to say that Israel and the US will become enemies, obviously, but it's hard to imagine the special relationship remaining quite so special. The latest issue of our magazine is out now, and if you want our best value ever, subscribing and using code SUMMER26 gets you your first copy for as cheap as £4.99, as well as 20% off as long as you stay subscribed. I told you about one of the articles at the start of this video, but this issue is truly jam-packed with content from all around the world. Obviously, the headline section is our rundown of Trump's wars around the world, discussing all of the different countries and regions that have faced Trump's military wrath, going nation by nation through our timeline, and reaching the ultimate question: has Trump created the modern holy war? From there, we dive into our regional sections, starting with the UK, where we unpack the results of the recent elections, take a look at the UK's odd foreign posture, and discuss if Britain has become ungovernable. Then in our EU section, we discuss how Russia's sphere of influence is fading, why Europe's energy transition isn't what you'd expect, as well as looking at the Euro's missing members. Finally, in the global section, we discuss whether we're seeing echoes of the First World War, what's next for Iran, as well as what really came from the Gen Z protests we saw emerging last year. That's not even everything. With this 80-page issue, our joint longest ever, there's even more to read than I've been able to mention here. So click the link in the description to learn more and grab your copy today.